Today I'm going to talk about component libraries, and especially the ones you build from scratch, not the ones you use from open source. And today I'm going to talk more about the bad things rather than the good things, because knowing what is bad is very easy to understand, but what is right and what works for a particular use case is very hard. So today it's most about what you're not supposed to, and there's a small subset you might apply for your particular use case. So before we start, like a few things about myself, just to give you some context. So I love engineering as a general, especially structural engineering and aviation engineering. Somehow software engineers think that they always reinvent the wheel, which is not the case. Most things that we do are very fundamental principles that are used everywhere in other disciplines. So what I would suggest is if you want to become a better engineer, I would suggest to look outside of software, because if you know how bridges and buildings are being built, or how an airplane is in the air and is not falling down, it's very applicable to everyday life of software engineering, because we have to deal with redundancy, they have to deal with the redundancy, and all sorts of things. Another thing, I love refactoring and I love changing code without adding any extra features. So I'm the kind of person that product managers and product owners usually really hate, because I can very easily refactor like 100,000 lines of code without adding anything. So like there's a balance to be made. You need good infrastructure and a good product. So if I'm the only one in the team, I usually make very bad decisions. So there's a balance. And third thing is, I say I love memes, which is true. Like we have fun all the time. And I think part of a good culture within the company is to not take everything seriously, because more you stress about your failures and things not going as expected, worse results you get. So actually the most active channel that we have in our company is for memes, and I think that is great. So like people who have good sense of humor are surprisingly good engineers in most cases. And about my work experience, so for a few years I was working on a website builder. Now they call like a no-code tool these days, like Bubble and such. And so we had to deal with a lot of components. There was a lot of dynamicity. We had a lot of performance issues. And because of that, like we had to deal with many hardcore front-end stuff. And I think most of the mistakes were made during that time, and that's when I learned the most. And I'm going to share a lot of things based from that experiences. Right now, I'm working for a small startup, which we've started like about a year ago. So we have this hypothesis. We believe that communities and community leaders are best way to find the best talent. And we think that the way current hiring system works is broken. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a global network of communities and community leaders. And that is the way we think we can help companies find the best talent, not just locally, but worldwide. So now let's get to business. So I'm sure most of you, or maybe all of you, use like these major component libraries or CSS frameworks, like Bootstrap or InDesign. Like everybody has their preference, but I'm sure there's at least one, if not many, that you are using every day. You either love it or hate it, or you're somewhere in between. And let's ask a very important question: is what is exactly that we loved about these open source libraries? Because we're kind of very attached to them, and there are some very good reasons for that. And I think the first one, and the one that most people oversee, is great documentation, because there are many out-of-the-box examples, things that are very easily searchable on Google, which is very important. And if you have a problem, you may already have an answer on Stack Overflow. You can just simply ask a question. So having a large community and large internet presence is very important. Another one is that usually these component libraries are developed by the best engineers. So that means that they have really high quality code. And usually what happens is before something goes to open source, especially by large companies, it goes through multiple steps of iteration. So that means that the things that they are giving you are very solid and very reliable. And usually like the large libraries are backed by big companies like Facebooks and Googles and Amazons and such. Or even if it's not backed by a large vendor, it's usually backed by a large community. A community that you can trust and know is going to take care of the product, and it's going to be there for the foreseeable future. And because of that, it's very battle tested, and for the most part, you don't have to worry about the reliability of, let's say, material design, Bootstrap, Chakra, or whatever, and that is really great, and that's really powerful. And another big thing is consistency. So if you're using like material design, you know it's been developed using a unified design system. So every component was designed to be used, mixed and matched at the same time. So they have same patterns, same principles, and you're not afraid of putting two components and things not adding up. It's like Lego components, and they magically click, and that's great. And finally, usually those libraries are quite small and quite fast, especially the newer ones, because they usually give you like a very good performance out of the box. They use like various optimizations from tree shaking to like crazy stuff, and you may actually use some great features by them without even thinking twice. So you have all this experience of like the best engineers in this world, and you don't have to think about it. But there are problems, because if you're only using a single component library and you have all sets of components that you need, chances are you're okay. You don't have to worry about anything. You're lucky. But usually there happens a case when you need a component or a set of components that your core library is missing. And that's usually where the trouble begins, because it can be a slightly different select, a drop-down, a tree view, or some kind of crazy thing that you really need. It's business critical for your use case, but unfortunately Bootstrap or Material does not offer it. And so what happens usually is that what any good engineer would do, you would search for Google for 5 minutes, you would find the first library that pops up, which usually has like 1 or 5 stars, and bam, you install it and you think it's a problem solved. So I'll try to convince you why that's a very dangerous thing to do. And I'm generally against lesser known libraries that are not backed by large vendors. And so I want to give you some good examples why doing this is a very bad idea. So the first one, and it's probably very obvious, is they're very unreliable. So if a library has few stars, it means it has very few traction and engagement. If it has been updated a long time ago, well, that's tough. And especially if there's lots of piled unresolved issues, that means that people are either not spending as much time as they're supposed to, or they just completely abandon the project. And usually small projects who are just published on GitHub are unreliable because they don't test anything. Like they just, a random engineer like quickly scrambled something, he or she liked it, put it on GitHub, it works, but like tomorrow it could very easily break. There's no test for it, and that's a problem. Another thing regarding the quality is that many small, lesser-known libraries could be very big and could be very bulky. This is not an exaggeration. There are cases where adding a single external dependency can increase your bundle size by a few hundred kilobytes, which is like crazy. And unfortunately, as you guys were discussing React and React hooks, writing high-quality code in React, for example, and not having resource leaks is very hard to do unless you're a very experienced engineer. So I've seen countless projects out in the wild that are extensively used who have just resource leaks. So if you're using this drop-down and you unmount it, tough luck. Some things still persist and you're clogging your memory. So that's a big problem. And another big issue is with conflicts. So that small library could not work with what you're either already using, or it could be a problem that you want to upgrade to the next version of Angular, Vue, React, or whatever. And that small library has not been updated. That may never be updated, so you're kind of stuck. So, another key thing is inconsistency, is because you have this clean slate, both in terms of code and in terms of UI, of components by a large vendor, like let's say Bootstrap, and you suddenly added like a component that's written in a very different way. So your coding style and the way you're thinking may mismatch with the vendor, or your UI and like UX decisions could be completely different, because you may have like certain kind of paradigm and like a list of forms, and the minute you add an external component, it's really difficult to match that unified style. You can always try your best and like mimic your native look and feel, but it's never the thing that people like, and there's always the problem. And as a consequence, the final problem of small, lesser-known libraries is the problem of customizability, because almost all small libraries offer some way of like altering CSS or changing markup somehow, but usually it's never enough. And the standard API that they provide gives you a very small set of features you can use, and now you have to hack it, like write a very specific selector or do this hack, and you're incurring more and more technical debt because of that. And if you're not using just a single small library and you have a few, which is usually what happens, then your code is becoming worse and worse. And another thing that many companies do these days is they stack component libraries on top of each other. They say, I like Bootstrap or like Ant Design, and what I want to do is I want to build a component library on top of it. Like Bootstrap can have their button, but I want to have my own custom button because my button does this. That's very domain specific. So I want to customize it to my needs. And what they do is they wrap the components inside their components. In some cases, actually, that's a reasonable idea, but in many cases, again, there are many severe problems for that. So the first one is poor performance, because if you're stacking two component libraries on top of each other, usually the first problem is DOM because there are way too many elements, and usually like rendering performance is really problematic because there are parts that you've developed and there are parts that other vendors have developed, so coordinating changes and making sure that your side and their side matches is usually difficult. In the beginning, everything, by the way, seems perfect, and you just take a Bootstrap button and you like wrap inside your button and you call like my company button. But like as the number of components increases, especially with like big things, like they have this crazy data tables and filters and tree views and stuff, like it's always the issue because a single component can have so many nodes in the DOM, just that component could become a bottleneck itself. You struggle with developer experience because if something is big and bulky, you get slower compilation if you're using TypeScript or like slower build. And I think the bigger problem is live reloads because iteration speed for development time is very key. So the slower your stack is, like less likely you are to make experiments or do your due diligence. So larger your application becomes and slower it is, actually people usually make worse and worse decisions and stop caring about the quality of the software that they produce. And another key thing is emergence of God components. A God component is a component that has like 100 props. You have to somehow magically configure it. There's only one guy in the company who knows how to configure that component. And basically everybody's afraid of changing it because if you open that component, like thousands of if statements, like branches, and you have no idea what's going on, and it's difficult to deal with. And because of all this, it becomes very rigid, and even making trivial or in the worst case, non-trivial change sometimes requires like a complete rewrite of the library. I've heard many times development teams said that this is something that we cannot implement right now, and if we were to do that, we have to completely rewrite it. So this increases tension between the product side and the development side, and the product side just doesn't understand the problem. Like, if this is something that's business critical and it's important to us, how come we cannot do this? And explaining the whole like technical stuff is usually challenging and very difficult. And as we've said, and I'm going to come back to this over and over again, it's the problem with customizability. So Bootstrap and every other library is developed in a certain mindset. It's flexible, but it's not infinitely flexible. So if you're okay with their approach, that's fine. But if you're going in a different direction, sometimes making changes will require hacks, and you'll customize that component, those things so much you're actually going to regret it. And the third thing about customizability is that as, let's say, Bootstrap or like Semantic or some other library like has a certain set of design principles that you want to follow, but the problem is your designer just wants to go in a completely different direction and you're still using this library. So what usually happens in this case is that CSS is the biggest bottleneck. So you have to write the spaghetti code to match what you have in Figma or XD versus what you have inside the code, and everything is getting worse and worse. And because of this, you very quickly reach physical limits because you realize there's only so many things you can customize from even a very good component library, and you're just stuck with the things that you have. And because of that, like one thing that's really hot these days is optimizing like micro interactions and being very UX first, right? And UX first with an external open source library is only possible if your intentions align. But the minute you have different expectations, if you want to develop a tool for a power user and you're using material design, tough luck because material design, for the most part, uses a lot of white space. And the way material is designed is for end users. And if you want like lots of dashboards and forms and stuff, and you want it to be friendly for people who use it 24/7, usually material is not a good choice for that. And it can be said for many other libraries as well. And because of that, what happens is that your code becomes out of sync with what designer has. And in the beginning, like designers and developers work together to make sure that what you have in like design tools like Figma or Sketch very nicely aligns with what you have in code. But as the technical debt piles up, like developers and designers just stop caring, and you realize that it's two completely divergent universes. Like, there's a button in the Figma, and there's a button in the storybook, and they're 80% same, but there's lots of significant differences, and that as time goes on becomes obviously worse and worse. And because of this, you have reduced velocity because you need new features, and you need those new features really fast. But because you have such a large technical debt, you kind of have to think about infrastructure. So you're very slow. And if you face this, by the way, everything that I've said is something that I've personally faced for multiple years. I've tried multiple component libraries, and honestly, for the most part, they're great. But after years of torture and experimentation, I asked myself this question, is that what if we just get rid of that? Maybe like Bootstrap or Material or React, sorry, not React, Bootstrap or like Material, Semantic or Ant, maybe they're overheads in some small and narrow use cases, because for the most part, they're great. And before I thought about all the good things, again, I thought about all the bad things. So if I write a component library from scratch myself with my team, what are the bad things that I have to deal with, because I want to know what the costs are up front. And so let's consider a case that we've developed a component library from bare metal, just HTML and CSS. We're not using any kind of fancy things. And what are the problems that we're going to face daily? And the first big one, and I think this is business critical, so you cannot make this big decision without consulting with the product and business side, is the upfront cost. Like the time and effort it takes to develop a component library is a lot. So initially, your velocity is going to be quite small. And I think second, and probably this is the largest issue, is lack of talent. Because to develop a component library, you need engineers who have in-depth understanding of a particular technology. So if your stack is on React, you need people who understand how, like, I don't know, hooks, reconciler, core, and every other thing works. Or if you're using Angular, you have to very well understand how, like, change detection or modules or any kind of things work and what are the best practices. And finding experienced people and retaining them is really difficult these days. And it's not just developers, it's also designers, because what happens is that unless you have a designer who has prior experience with developing design systems, for them it would be their first rodeo. And designers like to experiment and change things all the time, which is great for the most use case. But if you're developing a fundamental part of the infrastructure, you have to develop by the kind of people who have prior experience, and it's not time for experimentation. So another thing, and that's pretty given, is you need constant maintenance. If you develop a custom component library, chances are it's going to be more than 100. It could be 200, maybe a few hundred, depending on how you measure small and big components and how you compose them. And the component library itself becomes a product. So you need a product owner, you need a backlog, like a sprints to maintain that component library, and make sure that the incentives of your company align with the incentives of this particular product, the component library. So it's a beast on its own, and unless you're comfortable with taking all the risks, chances are you should not do it. Another big thing, remember how I said the best thing about Bootstrap and Material and all the other libraries is that they're ubiquitous. They're all over the place. And you can hire a new engineer who already knows all that stuff. You don't have to teach them, you don't have to train them. If you have something in-house and you've developed from scratch, nobody's going to know that. So you have to write all the documentation, which most people do not like, unfortunately. And you have to write a whole plethora of tests. You need a good test suite and coverage, because if you have a component library, chances are you're going to use it all over the place. And chances are you're going to have a suite of applications, right? In different branches or different products. So testing and documentation could be larger bottlenecks in this case, because even if you initially put a lot of effort and you think you're done, you're not. It's just the beginning. And the final thing is quality control. If somebody believes that a small company or even a large one, unless they're Google scale, can develop a component library that's as good as Material or Bootstrap or all the things that we know, it's crazy. Your code will never be as good as they are, and your decisions will never be as good as the ones they've made. But the good thing is that you don't need to be the best component library in the world. You need to be the best component library for your use case. And beating open source generic versions in that situation becomes more tangible. And now let's discuss the most important part of this talk, is that what are some good reasons and what are some benefits that a company will receive if they have their own custom, tailor-made set of components. And the first one is, again, it's built for you, so it's solving your problem, not somebody else's problem. It's your problem, and that means that you can customize it to your domain, and your domain can be very different compared to the rest of the world. So you can make your look and feel, your competitive advantage. If you feel UX is more important, you can optimize UX as much as you want. If you want a slick UI that's pixel perfect, you can also do that. You can go crazy with it. If you have enough resources from the design side and the engineering side, possibilities are probably endless. And another very major thing is regain consistency. If you're developing this, chances are you have a unified design system. Chances are that those two components somewhere live side by side, and designers and developers check if they match. And what happens is that when you have a customer and the customer goes to your dashboard, they don't feel that the components were made in two separate places and they were somehow bolted together with a duct tape. They were coherently made in a nice manner, and when you look at them, they make sense, especially from the UX perspective. And what happens is that if you don't have stacking, and if you're not using something else, and you know performance issues and you've dealt with it previously, it's pretty easy to achieve decent performance because, it's pretty easy to achieve decent performance out of the box. That's a big plus, especially with if you previously had stack libraries and you just completely get rid of it. We've seen cases where by getting rid of material design, the number of DOM elements decreased by 5-fold, by 5 times. And one thing that was really important is that the depth of the trees decreased by 3, which is especially important for reconciliation for React, for example. So it's a difficult decision to make, but if you decide to go to this side, then that's great. And dependencies are an issue. Again, as I've said, having lesser known libraries will make your life easier. So if you have your set of component libraries, you need to use lesser and lesser things. So that's also a big win. And it's really great for the engineering team. When you're telling your team, okay, we're developing this from scratch, they have to learn a whole lot of things, and it's a very challenging experience. And they want to solve hard problems. In most cases in engineering, things that we do on daily are bug fixes and features. It could be not as exhilarating as developing something large. So it could help you potentially to retain talent. And finally, just to quickly wrap things up, we're almost done, is that I'm going to quickly suggest a few things that can help you with developing component library, because we have way more experience and way more tools right now than we've ever had. So the first one is the obvious one. We have design systems, experience with design systems, and it's becoming more and more common amongst companies and design community. Another one is you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Even if you're not using Bootstrap or Material, you can look at their code base or you can look at their documentation. You can reuse their naming, their patterns, and their decisions. So even if you're not using their code, converting their experience to your domain and adapting that to your particular application will yield much better results. Another good thing is that, for example, I love both Figma and Storybook, and there's like really good things you can do to synchronize Figma and Storybook. So that means that you can have a synchronized version of your component both in the design side and the development side. And I think that has to also be incorporated in the product part, because when a product manager says that this particular task for this component is complete, they have to take ownership that this is complete both in the design side and Figma is working the way it's supposed to. It's updated in the code, and you can see in the storybook, documentation is there and tests are there. Unless you have process and discipline inside the company, doing something as big is very challenging. And you have a lot of headless libraries. Previously, you used to use everything that was rendering something visual, like a markup. You have now many libraries like Popper.js or Downshift, or there are many tools, and the number is increasing day by day, that do not render a single line of HTML. What they do is they help you with heavy lifting. They help you with state management or some kind of issue that's really important. You don't have to deal with it, but markup is your responsibility, and you can render the way you like. And finally is we have modern browsers with modern APIs, which are way more consistent than they were a few years ago. They have flexibility, like just the things that you receive from like Flexbox and Gridbox and like modern JavaScript APIs is mind-blowing to people who used to write JavaScript like 10 years ago. So previously, the component libraries were used to make this standard and compatible in all browsers. Today, a large suite of things work out of the box on any major browser. Actually, these were the key things that I wanted to talk about today. And there's one final thing I want to say, and probably this may be the most important thing that I say today, is that the answer to the question, do you need to write a custom component library, is almost always no, and should be a default answer. And unless you convince yourself, your team, and the whole company that this is something that's business critical and it's going to yield better results, you're probably not supposed to do that, because it requires lots of resources, and that means that only very well-funded startups and only large companies can afford this luxury. Thank you very much. If you have questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Հարցեր, կարող եք հայերենով տակ, եթե ուզում եք, բայց նախընտրենք անգլերենով։ Հա, հարց ունեք դուք։ Ասա ջան։
Ինչ կարող է պատմել Chakra UI-ի մասին, ինչ կարծիք ունի։
Chakra
UI library-ի մասին, այսինքն ինքը շատ customizable է, այսինքն ինքը տալիս է UI library, բայց դրա հետ մեկտեղ շատ customizable է, ու կարող ես իրան քո դիզայնին հավասարապես սարքել։ Եթե ինչ-որ կոմպոնենտներ չկան, library-ի մեջ դու կարող ես սարքել։
So he's asking about Chakra. Are you familiar with the library?
I'm not using, but lots of my friends are, so I'm kind of familiar.
I guess he has some experience with it. He's saying that it's a very extensible library, which also has hooks to allow you to create your own custom components using some extensions, I guess. So, okay, if you're not familiar with it, maybe we just skip this one.
No, I can give you like a generic answer. Like if it was more like material-based Bootstrap or something else, I would give you like a more concrete answer. Like a general rule of thumb is that any large open source project has like a set of decisions that they've made, and if that decisions align with what you do, go for it. A lot of people use Chakra. It's very powerful and it's useful, but you'll always find a use case when any large component library will simply fail because your intentions are here and their intentions are there.
Awesome. Թարգմանեմ թե բարձր? Բարձր, okay. This one does.
What do you think about style component when you create custom component using?
So if I understand correctly, the question is about style components and what I personally think about it, right? Okay. I liked style components generally as a whole. So to give you experience from our team, like we used to be very JSS heavy company, and all our styles to this day are written in JavaScript, and we're about to migrate to style components. We're gonna use Emotion. I personally think that I like the whole concept of using JavaScript objects as styles because I like to programmatically and dynamically design them. Because when I was developing a no-code tool, we had to generate lots of CSS on the fly. So having JSON or JavaScript is useful because you can save representation in a database, then you can take that representation and generate as a style. So my answer is that if your application is very static, styled components are amazing, go for it, they have great tools. The more dynamicity you introduce to your project, and especially it's something that requires like drag and drop and having like state in database, I think in many cases the concept of CSS becomes more of a bottleneck.
Eli Hartog? So?
We're done. I'm sorry, you said we're done, right? Perfect, thank you very much.